people love to call it luck because luck is easier to admire than sacrifice. The applause had barely faded when I stepped off the stage holding a polished glass award with my company's name engraved beneath mine. Cameras flashed, reporters congratulated me, and business leaders shook my hand as if success had arrived overnight. They saw a confident entrepreneur accepting an award for building one of the fastest-growing manufacturing technology companies in Ohio. They saw a tailored Navy suit, a calm smile, and a speech about teamwork, perseverance, and responsibility. What they did not see were the years that had disappeared before anyone noticed my name. My phone buzzed as I walked toward the parking garage. It was a message from my mother reminding me about our usual Sunday family dinner. I smiled, slipped the award into the passenger seat of my car, and started driving across Columbus. Family dinners had always been important in our house. My parents believed that no matter how busy life became, Sunday evenings belonged to family. I respected that tradition because it reminded me of simpler years, long before board meetings, investors, and company expansions became part of my daily routine. When I arrived, my father, Daniel Miller, was already standing on the front porch with his usual cup of coffee. He smiled, gave me a quick hug, and noticed the garment bag hanging in the back seat. "Big meeting today?" he asked. "Something like that," I answered with a grin. Inside, my mother, Susan Miller, was finishing dinner while my younger sister Emily arranged plates on the table. The smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh dinner rolls filled the kitchen exactly the way it had since I was a child. For a few minutes, everything felt perfectly ordinary. We talked about neighborhood news, Emily's new teaching job, and my parents' plans to renovate their backyard before winter arrived. Then my mother noticed the award sitting beside my chair after I carried it inside. She picked it up carefully and read the inscription out loud. Midwest Entrepreneur of the Year. She smiled politely before placing it back on the table. "That is certainly impressive." My father laughed softly. "Your timing has always been incredible, Ethan." I looked up from my plate. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "You started your company just when manufacturing bounced back. You happened to meet the right investors. You happened to launch the right products. Sometimes life simply lines up for people." Emily nodded as she reached for another dinner roll. "Dad is right. Plenty of hardworking people never get opportunities like yours." I listened quietly. It was not the first time I had heard those words. Over the past several years, almost every family conversation about my business somehow arrived at the same conclusion. I had been fortunate. I had met the right people. I had entered the market at the perfect time. I had caught a lucky break. Nobody meant to insult me. They genuinely believed they were complimenting me. Yet every time they called my success luck, they unknowingly erased thousands of decisions nobody had ever witnessed. My mother smiled warmly. "You have always been blessed, sweetheart. Some people just have good fortune following them." I nodded slowly and continued eating without arguing. There was no point. I had learned long ago that people rarely change their minds because of explanations. They changed when they finally saw something for themselves. My father leaned back in his chair. "I remember when you left your engineering job. Honestly, I thought it was a risky decision. Then somehow everything worked out." I almost laughed at the phrase "somehow everything worked out." There had been nothing mysterious about those years. Nothing had simply worked out. Every small victory had demanded something valuable in return. But I only smiled and said, "I guess things turned out all right." After dinner, my mother packed leftovers into containers for me to take home, just as she always did. My father walked me to the driveway carrying the award I had nearly forgotten inside. He handed it to me and smiled proudly. "You should enjoy this, son. Not everyone gets this lucky." I thanked him sincerely because I knew his words came from love, not cruelty. Still, as I placed the award back into the passenger seat, those words echoed in my mind more loudly than the applause from earlier that afternoon. Lucky. It was amazing how one simple word could erase years of sleepless nights, impossible choices, and silent disappointments. During the drive home, I stopped at a red light and glanced at the award beside me. The polished glass reflected the city lights as evening settled over Columbus. Most people would probably believe that little trophy represented success. To me, it represented survival. It reminded me of every morning I had doubted myself before getting back to work anyway. It reminded me of promises I had made to myself when nobody believed I could build anything meaningful. By the time I reached my house, I carried the award inside and placed it on a bookshelf without much thought. It was never the recognition that mattered. It was what recognition failed to explain. I stood by the living room window looking out into the quiet neighborhood as memories I had spent years keeping to myself slowly returned. If luck truly built successful companies, then no one would ever need to know what had happened 5 years earlier. Unfortunately for that comforting belief, luck had never been sitting beside me during the darkest nights, and the story my parents believed was only the final chapter of a journey whose real beginning they had never even imagined. 5 years earlier, there had been no awards, no interviews, and certainly no reason for anyone to believe I was building something extraordinary. There was only a cardboard box sitting in the back seat of my aging sedan as I drove away from the engineering company where I had spent nearly 8 years of my career. The layoff was handled professionally. My manager thanked me for my dedication, explained that restructuring had eliminated several positions, and wished me the best. I shook his hand, smiled politely, and walked out of the building carrying everything that had once fit inside my office. I remember sitting in my car for nearly 20 minutes afterward without turning the key. The silence felt heavier than the box beside me. I had always believed that if I worked hard enough, I could control my future. That afternoon taught me that life rarely followed plans as neatly as we hoped. When I finally drove home, I decided not to tell my parents the full truth. I simply said the company was reorganizing and that I was considering new opportunities. They encouraged me to apply for another engineering position immediately. It sounded reasonable, and perhaps it would have been the safest decision, but something inside me refused to ignore an idea that had quietly followed me for years. During my time as an engineer, I had visited dozens of manufacturing facilities across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. No matter where I traveled, I kept hearing the same complaints. Smaller manufacturers wanted practical automation solutions, but most providers focused only on enormous corporations with equally enormous budgets. I believed there was room for a company willing to serve businesses that everyone else overlooked. The idea had lived in a notebook on my desk for almost 3 years. Losing my job suddenly transformed that notebook from a distant dream into the only direction I wanted to pursue. I emptied my savings account, rented a small warehouse on the edge of Columbus, and purchased secondhand equipment that larger companies no longer wanted. Every dollar mattered. Instead of hiring employees immediately, I became every department myself. In the morning, I answered customer emails. Before lunch, I designed equipment layouts. During the afternoon, I assembled components, loaded deliveries into my car, and visited clients. At night, I cleaned the warehouse floor, updated invoices, studied technical manuals, and searched for the next opportunity. There were evenings when I finally looked at the clock and realized it was almost 2 in the morning. A few hours later, I would wake up and start again before sunrise. The warehouse had no heating system during my first winter because I could not justify the expense. I wore 2 jackets while working and kept a small space heater beside my desk that barely warmed my hands. Whenever customers visited, I quietly turned the heater toward them instead. I wanted them to feel comfortable even if I did not. Money disappeared faster than I expected. Every unexpected repair, every delayed payment, and every canceled order forced me to recalculate the budget all over again. Several times I questioned whether I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Yet every morning I unlocked that warehouse because giving up would have guaranteed failure, while continuing still left room for hope. My parents believed I was consulting for different companies while exploring business ideas. I never corrected that assumption because I did not want them worrying every time another challenge appeared. Whenever my mother asked how things were going, I smiled and answered, "I am making progress." Technically, it was true. She simply imagined much smoother progress than reality. There were weekends when friends invited me to fishing trips, football games, or short vacations. I politely declined every invitation because even one extra day away from work felt like a luxury I could not afford. Slowly, the invitations stopped arriving. People assumed I had become too busy or no longer cared. The truth was much simpler. I was investing every available hour into keeping a dream alive that had not yet given anyone else a reason to believe in it. One evening, I sat alone in the warehouse, staring at a whiteboard covered with calculations that refused to balance. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. 2 customers had postponed payments. A supplier expected money I did not yet have. I remember lowering my head onto the desk and wondering whether determination alone could carry a business much farther. That night, I almost called a former colleague to ask whether his company was still hiring engineers. My phone was already in my hand when I noticed the notebook containing the original business idea lying beneath several invoices. I opened it and read the first sentence I had written years earlier. It said, "Build the company you always wished existed." Those words reminded me why I had accepted uncertainty in the first place. I put the phone away and returned to work. The breakthrough arrived quietly rather than dramatically. A family-owned manufacturing business accepted one of my proposals after a much larger competitor ignored them because the project was considered too small. I treated that customer as though they were the largest company in America. I answered every call personally, delivered every promise on schedule, and visited the facility whenever questions arose. A month later, they referred me to another customer. Then another. Slowly, the empty warehouse became busier. Equipment filled corners that had once echoed with silence. The bank account remained fragile, but for the first time it was moving in the right direction. Looking back now, people often assume the hardest part of building a company was solving technical problems or finding customers. They are mistaken. The hardest part was waking up every morning while nobody believed anything meaningful was happening, including many of the people I loved most. Long before anyone called me successful, I had already spent years learning how to keep moving forward without applause, without certainty, and without anyone realizing just how close I had come to walking away forever. Over the next 3 years, the small warehouse that had once echoed with silence slowly transformed into a thriving company. Although the changes happened so gradually that I barely noticed them while living through each day. One satisfied customer became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became contracts that stretched across several states. Every new opportunity arrived because someone trusted us enough to recommend our work to another business owner. We never became the cheapest company in the market, and we certainly never spent large amounts of money on advertising. Our reputation grew because we answered the phone when customers called, admitted mistakes when they happened, and treated every project, no matter how small, with the same level of commitment. I believe that trust was the only investment that continued paying dividends long after invoices had been forgotten. As revenue became more stable, I hired my first employee, then a second, and eventually a small team that shared the same values I had tried to build from the beginning. During every interview, I asked applicants a simple question that surprised many of them. I never started by asking about technical skills. Instead, I asked, "Tell me about a promise you refused to break." Skills could be taught. Integrity was much harder to develop. That philosophy shaped every hiring decision and eventually became part of the company's identity. By the time we moved into a larger facility outside Columbus, people often commented on the atmosphere inside the building. Employees greeted one another by name. Supervisors worked beside technicians whenever deadlines became demanding, and customers frequently remarked that the company felt different from most businesses they had visited. I quietly smiled whenever I heard those comments because they confirmed something I had hoped from the very beginning. We were not simply building equipment. We were building a place where people genuinely wanted to work. Ironically, the more successful the company became, the simpler my own lifestyle remained. I continued living in the same modest house I had purchased before launching the business. I drove the same reliable sedan that had carried the cardboard box from my engineering job years earlier. While many people assumed successful entrepreneurs constantly upgraded their lifestyles, I preferred investing profits back into the business. Every additional machine increased production capacity. Every new employee strengthened our future. Every training program improved the quality of our work. I found far greater satisfaction watching the company grow than watching my driveway fill with expensive possessions. None of those choices seemed unusual to me, but they became another reason my parents believed luck explained everything. During Sunday dinners, my father often laughed whenever I described another business milestone. "Things just keep falling into place for you," he would say while pouring another cup of coffee. My mother usually smiled and added, "Some people have a gift for being in the right place at exactly the right time." I never argued because explaining years of discipline in a few sentences always sounded like making excuses. Besides, I still hoped that one day they would see the company with their own eyes instead of imagining it through brief conversations around the dinner table. A few weeks after receiving the Entrepreneur Award, our operations manager, Lauren Mitchell, knocked on my office door carrying a folder filled with schedules and presentation notes. Lauren had joined the company during our second year, and her calm leadership had become one of the reasons we continued expanding without losing the culture that mattered so much to me. Andrew Foster confirmed his visit for Thursday morning, she said. His team wants the full facility tour before discussing the partnership. I nodded while reviewing the proposed schedule. Andrew Foster led one of the largest industrial investment firms in the Midwest. His company had followed our growth for nearly a year, and after months of conversations, they were finally considering a strategic partnership that could help us expand into additional markets without sacrificing our independence. It was the kind of opportunity that many entrepreneurs spent decades trying to secure. Yet despite its importance, I felt surprisingly calm. I had learned long ago that no meeting, no investor, and no contract could replace the daily responsibility of serving the customers who had trusted us from the beginning. Let us keep everything exactly the way it normally is, I told Lauren. No special decorations. No rehearsed speeches. I want them to see the real company. She smiled because she expected that answer. That is why they want to meet you, she replied. They have already visited companies with polished presentations. They want to understand why your employees stay and why your customers keep coming back. After she left my office, I walked through the production floor watching technicians assemble equipment that would soon be delivered to manufacturers across Ohio and neighboring states. Conversations flowed naturally. People exchanged ideas, solved problems together, and laughed while working. There was no need to create an impressive image for visitors because the company had never been built around appearances. It had been built around consistency. Later that afternoon, my father called while I was reviewing engineering drawings. Your mother found a beautiful luxury sport utility vehicle on sale, he said, cheerfully. With everything going so well for you, maybe it is finally time to reward yourself. I smiled even though he could not see it. I appreciate the suggestion, Dad. He laughed. You work too hard not to enjoy your success. After we ended the call, I looked through my office window toward the parking lot where my familiar sedan remained parked beside dozens of employee vehicles. My father genuinely believed success should become visible through what a person owned. I had slowly learned the opposite. The strongest success often remained invisible because it appeared in opportunities created for other people rather than possessions collected for yourself. I had no idea that within a few days, circumstances beyond anyone's plans would begin showing my parents a side of my life they had never truly seen before. Thursday morning began like dozens of other important days at the company, with a full calendar, fresh coffee, and employees already moving through the building before the sun had fully risen above the Columbus skyline. Lauren Mitchell met me near the entrance carrying a tablet filled with schedules, visitor badges, and final notes for Andrew Foster's arrival. Everything had been carefully organized, but there was no unusual tension in the air. Everyone simply continued doing what they always did. Production teams reviewed quality reports. Engineers gathered around design tables discussing adjustments for a customer project, and shipping crews prepared deliveries that had to leave before noon. I walked through the facility greeting people by name, asking about their families, and checking on projects that had been progressing throughout the week. Several employees stopped me briefly with questions that took only a few minutes to resolve because I believed leadership was never about hiding inside an office while others handled every challenge. Just before 9 o'clock, Lauren informed me that Andrew Foster's flight had landed ahead of schedule and that his car would arrive in approximately 30 minutes. I thanked her and returned to my office to review one final presentation. Before I could begin, my phone rang. It was my mother. Good morning, sweetheart, she said cheerfully. Your father and I are already out running errands. We realized we are only about 15 minutes from your office. We thought maybe we could stop by for a quick hello if you are not too busy. For a brief moment, I considered suggesting another day because the timing was far from ideal. Then I smiled. Of course. Come by any time. Lauren will let you in when you arrive. My mother sounded genuinely excited. Wonderful. We have never actually seen where you work. After hanging up, I realized she was right. Despite years of hearing me talk about projects and customers, neither of my parents had ever visited the company. Somehow schedules had never aligned, and perhaps none of us had made enough effort to change that. I informed Lauren that my parents would be stopping by before the investor arrived. She smiled warmly. We will make them feel welcome. About 20 minutes later, I received a message that a supplier needed clarification regarding a shipment scheduled for the following morning. Rather than handling it over the phone, I walked across the production floor to speak directly with the logistics team. The discussion lasted longer than expected because several details required immediate decisions. While we reviewed shipping schedules, Lauren quietly welcomed my parents into the reception area. They admired the modern lobby, the company logo displayed behind the front desk, and photographs showing completed manufacturing projects across several states. My mother later admitted she had expected a much smaller office. Instead, she found a busy headquarters with engineers moving between conference rooms, customers arriving for meetings, and employees greeting one another with confidence. Lauren invited them to enjoy coffee while explaining that I was helping resolve a customer issue and would join them shortly. Rather than waiting, my father asked whether they could walk through part of the building. Lauren happily agreed because there was nothing inside the company that needed to be hidden. As they entered the main production area, they immediately noticed how many people seemed focused yet relaxed. Forklifts moved carefully through marked pathways. Teams discussed measurements around partially assembled equipment. Large windows filled the building with natural light instead of the dim industrial atmosphere many factories carried. My parents quietly observed everything while Lauren explained how different departments worked together from initial design through final installation. What surprised them most was not the equipment itself, but the number of employees who greeted them with genuine smiles after learning they were my parents. One technician paused what he was doing long enough to shake my father's hand. "It is nice to meet you," he said. "Your son gave me my first opportunity after I spent almost a year looking for work. I will always be grateful for that." Before my father could respond, another employee smiled and added, "He still remembers the names of our children. That says a lot about the kind of place this is." My parents exchanged a quick glance, but said very little. As Lauren continued leading them through the facility, similar conversations happened again and again. A project manager explained how I personally stayed late to help solve customer problems whenever deadlines became difficult. An engineer mentioned that I insisted every new employee receive additional training instead of simply expecting them to figure everything out alone. A receptionist laughed while describing how I still answered the main office phone whenever everyone else became busy. None of those comments sounded rehearsed. They were offered naturally by people simply describing ordinary workdays. Meanwhile, I remained unaware that my parents were hearing these conversations because I was still finalizing shipping arrangements on the opposite side of the building. When I eventually walked toward the conference room to prepare for Andrew Foster's arrival, I noticed Lauren standing beside my parents near one of the observation windows overlooking the production floor. Before I could wave, one of our senior supervisors approached them carrying several reports. He stopped after recognizing my father from photographs displayed during our annual family appreciation event. Smiling warmly, he said, something that caused both of my parents to become completely silent. "Your son built more than a successful company," he said. "He built a place where people feel respected every single day. None of us would be standing here without the chance he decided to take all those years ago." I froze for just a moment after hearing those words. My parents slowly turned toward me with expressions I had never seen before. For the first time since my business had begun, they were no longer looking at me as someone who had simply enjoyed fortunate timing. They were looking at a world they had never known existed, and I could tell from the questions already forming in their eyes that everything they believed about my journey had just begun to change. Edit. Andrew Foster arrived only a few minutes after my parents had finished touring the production floor, and the timing could not have been more unusual. My father and mother were still quietly absorbing everything they had just witnessed when Lauren welcomed our guests from the investment firm into the lobby. Andrew walked in with two members of his executive team, greeted everyone with a warm handshake, and immediately turned toward me with a broad smile. "Ethan, it is good to finally see the operation in person," he said. "We have heard a great deal about what you have built." I thanked him and introduced my parents before beginning the scheduled tour. Andrew smiled respectfully and shook both of their hands. "You must be very proud," he said. "Your son has earned an outstanding reputation throughout the industry." My parents thanked him politely, but I could tell they were surprised by the confidence in his voice. This was not someone offering a casual compliment. He was speaking with the certainty of a businessman who had spent months studying our company before deciding to visit. As we walked through the facility, Andrew asked detailed questions about production capacity, employee retention, customer satisfaction, and long-term strategy. I answered each one openly because I had never believed in impressing investors with exaggerated promises. If a challenge existed, I acknowledged it. If a mistake had taught us an important lesson, I shared it honestly. Andrew seemed to appreciate that approach far more than polished sales presentations. My parents quietly followed the conversation from a short distance behind us. I noticed my father listening more carefully than I had ever seen before. He was hearing discussions about supply chains, engineering improvements, expansion strategies, and employee development programs that sounded nothing like the simple image he had carried in his mind for years. After nearly an hour, we gathered in the main conference room overlooking the production floor. Coffee was served while Lauren distributed financial summaries and growth reports. Andrew reviewed the documents for several minutes before placing them neatly on the table. Then he looked directly at me. "One of the reasons we pursued this meeting," he said, "is because your company has achieved something that many larger organizations struggle to accomplish: growth without sacrificing culture." I smiled. "That has always been our priority." He nodded. "Our research confirmed that. Your employee retention is exceptional. Customer referrals remain your largest source of new business. That combination is very rare." My parents remained silent, but I noticed my mother's expression changing with every passing minute. She was no longer simply observing my workplace. She was discovering an entirely different version of my professional life than the one she had imagined. When the formal discussion ended, Andrew asked whether he could speak with me privately before leaving. We stepped into my office while everyone else remained in the conference room enjoying refreshments. After closing the door, Andrew smiled and said, "I have visited more than 40 companies over the past 2 years. Very few feel as authentic as this one. Whatever happens regarding our partnership, do not lose what makes this place different." His words meant more to me than any financial proposal. Numbers could always change. Reputation was much harder to earn. After thanking him, I escorted the investment team back toward the lobby. Before leaving, Andrew unexpectedly turned toward my parents once more. "I hope you realize something," he said kindly. "Companies like this are never accidents. They are built through thousands of difficult decisions that nobody else ever sees." My father simply nodded. For perhaps the first time in my life, he seemed unable to find immediate words. After our visitors departed, my parents prepared to head home as well. My mother hugged me a little longer than usual. "We should let you get back to work," she said softly. My father looked around the building one last time before speaking. "You have a lot of people depending on you here." "I do," I answered. "They depend on one another too." He nodded thoughtfully, and we said our goodbyes. That evening, after finishing several meetings, I returned home expecting an ordinary night. Instead, my phone rang just after dinner. It was Emily. "Mom and Dad have been talking about your company all afternoon," she said. "Dad keeps saying the place was much bigger than he expected." I laughed quietly. "It has taken a long time to get here." She hesitated before continuing. "They have also been searching your company online." That surprised me. My parents had never shown much interest in reading business articles or company websites before. "Really?" I asked. "Mom found an interview you gave last year. Dad watched a manufacturing conference where you spoke about leadership. Then they found another article explaining how you started the business after losing your engineering job." I leaned back in my chair without saying anything. Emily continued. "They did not know any of that. They honestly thought you left your old company because you wanted a change." I closed my eyes for a moment. I had never hidden the truth intentionally. I had simply never corrected the assumptions everyone naturally made. According to Emily, my parents spent the rest of the evening reading article after article, discovering stories about customer relationships, early financial struggles, and the years I had spent building the company one project at a time. They watched interviews where I spoke more about my employees than about myself. They found photographs of the original warehouse that looked nothing like the modern headquarters they had visited that morning. Piece by piece, the picture they had carried for years quietly began falling apart. They were finally seeing the entire journey instead of only the destination. And for the first time, they understood that the success everyone admired had been built on a foundation of sacrifices they had never known existed. That weekend, I invited my parents to my house for dinner instead of driving to theirs. I wanted a quieter setting where nobody would feel rushed and where conversations could unfold naturally instead of being interrupted by dishes, visitors, or familiar routines. My mother arrived carrying a homemade apple pie, while my father walked in holding a small bag of coffee beans he knew I liked. At first, everything felt normal. We talked about the changing weather, Emily's students, and the upcoming football season. Yet beneath every ordinary sentence rested an unusual silence that none of us seemed ready to break. Finally, after dinner, my father set his coffee cup on the table and looked directly at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course," I replied. He hesitated for several seconds before speaking again. Why did we never know how difficult those first years really were? I leaned back in my chair and thought carefully before answering. Because I never wanted my struggles to become your burden. My mother frowned gently. "But we are your parents." I smiled. "Exactly. You had already spent your lives solving problems for me. When I became an adult, I believed it was finally my turn to solve my own." The room became silent again. My father slowly nodded but did not interrupt, so I continued. "When I lost my engineering job, I remember sitting in my car wondering whether I had completely failed. I knew if I called you that afternoon, both of you would immediately tell me to find another stable position. You would have been trying to protect me, and I understand that. But I also knew I would probably never have another chance to build the company I had been imagining for years." My mother looked down at the table. "We really thought you had simply decided to change careers." "I know," I answered gently. "It seemed easier to let everyone believe that than to explain how uncertain everything really was." I walked into my home office and returned carrying the same worn notebook that had survived every move, every late night, and every difficult season. The cover had faded, and several pages were bent from years of use. I handed it to my father. As he slowly turned the pages, he found sketches of early machine designs, handwritten financial calculations, lists of potential customers, and dozens of crossed-out ideas that had never worked. Some pages contained nothing more than encouraging reminders I had written to myself after especially discouraging days. One page simply read, "Keep showing up tomorrow." Another said, "Progress is still progress, even when nobody notices." My father carefully closed the notebook and placed his hand on the cover without saying anything. I continued speaking quietly. There were months when I questioned every decision I had made. I remember standing inside that cold warehouse wearing 2 jackets because I could not justify paying for better heating. I remember eating the same inexpensive meals for weeks because every extra dollar belonged to the business instead of me. I remember watching friends take vacations, buy new homes, and move forward with their lives while I spent nearly every weekend inside that building hoping another customer would call. My mother looked at me with tears forming in her eyes, not because anything tragic had happened, but because she realized how much of my life had unfolded beyond her view. "Why did you never ask us for help?" she whispered. I smiled warmly. "Because I did not need someone else to carry my dream. I only needed the chance to keep carrying it myself." They both remained silent. I could see that they were replaying years of family conversations inside their minds, remembering every time they had casually described my success as fortunate timing without understanding what those words unintentionally dismissed. After another long pause, my father spoke again. "Andrew Foster said companies like yours are built through thousands of decisions people never see." I nodded. He was right. Nobody sees the birthdays you miss because a customer needs you. Nobody sees the evenings you spend rewriting proposals after everyone else has gone home. Nobody sees the projects that fail, the contracts you lose, the nights you lie awake wondering whether payroll will still be possible next month. People see the ribbon-cutting ceremony. They do not see the years spent pouring the foundation. My mother reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. "I wish we had known." I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You knew the son who came home for dinner whenever he could. You knew the person I tried to remain. You simply did not know every detail of the journey, and that was my choice." My father slowly shook his head. "I spent years believing success arrived because you happened to catch a lucky break. After visiting your company and reading those interviews, I realized luck might open a door once, but it cannot keep hundreds of people employed year after year." His voice carried no embarrassment, only honesty. I smiled because those words meant more to me than he probably realized. They told me he finally understood that success was never a single moment. It was thousands of ordinary mornings when quitting would have been easier than continuing. I stood and walked toward the living room window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood where the evening sun was beginning to disappear. Without turning around, I spoke one final thought that had stayed with me through every stage of the journey. The hardest price I ever paid was not money. Money can be earned again. The real cost was time. Years that could never be repeated. Family dinners I missed. Friendships that slowly faded. Countless mornings when nobody believed anything meaningful was happening except me. That is the part people never see when they call someone successful. Behind me, the room remained completely silent, and in that silence I realized my parents were no longer trying to understand my company. They were finally beginning to understand the man I had become while building it. The conversation that evening changed something inside all of us, although none of us said it out loud at the time. My parents stayed for another hour, but instead of talking about business, we found ourselves remembering ordinary moments from years ago. My mother laughed about the science projects I used to build on the dining room table. My father recalled teaching me how to repair an old lawn mower when I was 12 years old, insisting that understanding how something worked was always more valuable than simply replacing it. As we shared those memories, I realized many of the lessons that had helped me build my company had actually begun inside their home long before I ever opened my first warehouse. They had taught me patience, responsibility, and the importance of finishing what I started. Somehow, along the way, all of us had become so focused on the destination that we forgot where those values had first taken root. Before leaving that night, my father stopped beside the bookshelf where I had placed the Entrepreneur Award a few days earlier. He looked at it quietly for several seconds before turning back toward me. "I used to think that was the reward for your success," he said. "Now I understand it is only a reminder of everything that came before it." I smiled because he had expressed exactly what I had struggled to explain for years. The award itself had never changed. Only the meaning behind it had. After my parents drove home, I remained standing near the front window for a long time thinking about how easily people measure accomplishment by visible results while overlooking the invisible habits that create them. The next morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The production floor was still quiet as the first employees began arriving with coffee cups in their hands, greeting one another before another busy day started. Watching them reminded me that leadership had never been about proving anything to people who doubted me. It had always been about creating opportunities for others to build meaningful lives of their own. A little before 8 o'clock, Lauren Mitchell walked into my office carrying the weekly operations reports. She noticed I seemed unusually thoughtful and smiled. "Everything all right?" she asked. I nodded. "Better than all right. Sometimes people just need time to see the whole picture." She understood immediately. "Your parents?" I smiled. "Yes." Lauren laughed softly. I had a feeling something changed after their visit. She hesitated before adding, "You know, several employees mentioned how proud they were that your parents finally saw the company. They wanted them to understand why everyone enjoys working here." That comment stayed with me throughout the day. My employees had never viewed my parents as people who underestimated me. They simply wanted them to experience the same environment they appreciated every day. That realization reminded me that kindness often accomplishes what arguments never can. During lunch, I walked through the employee break room instead of eating in my office. Conversations immediately shifted from work to weekend plans, children's soccer games, home improvement projects, and upcoming family vacations. I enjoyed listening because these ordinary discussions represented something I had hoped for since opening the company. Years earlier, I had sacrificed many evenings and weekends while building the business. Now I wanted the people working beside me to enjoy the balance I had once struggled to find. Success meant very little if everyone around me had to sacrifice their lives just to achieve it. Later that afternoon, I received another phone call from my father. His voice sounded different from usual, calmer and more reflective. "Are you busy?" he asked. "I have a few minutes," I answered. "What is on your mind?" He was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Your mother and I have been talking all morning. We realized that every time we called you lucky, we thought we were giving you credit. We never imagined we were taking something away instead." I leaned back in my chair without interrupting. He continued, "We only saw the finished building. We never imagined the years you spent laying the foundation." I thanked him, but he gently stopped me. "No," he said. "Let me finish. Parents spend so much time trying to protect their children from disappointment that sometimes we fail to notice when those children quietly become stronger than we ever expected. Somewhere along the way, you stopped needing us to solve your problems, but you never stopped being our son. I think we forgot those two things can both be true." His words stayed with me long after the call ended. They reminded me that understanding often arrives slowly, built one honest conversation at a time rather than through a single dramatic moment. That evening, I found the old notebook again while organizing my office at home. I turned through the worn pages until I reached one of the earliest entries. Beneath a rough sketch of my first workshop, I had written a sentence that I had completely forgotten. It said, "If this company ever succeeds, never allow success to make you forget the people who helped you become the person capable of building it." I smiled because those words still felt true. My parents had not financed my business. They had not introduced me to investors or negotiated contracts. Yet they had shaped my character long before I understood how important character would become. They taught me to keep promises, to respect people regardless of their position, and to continue working even when recognition seemed far away. Those lessons had quietly followed me into every meeting, every hiring decision, and every difficult season of the company's growth. For years, I had wanted my parents to understand the price behind my accomplishments. Now I realized something equally important. I also wanted them to know that despite every hardship, every long night, and every sacrifice, I never blamed them for misunderstanding the journey. People can only judge what they are able to see, and my greatest challenge had never been proving them wrong. It had been remaining grateful enough to let the truth reveal itself with patience instead of pride. That lesson, more than any award hanging on my wall or contract sitting on my desk, became the achievement I valued most because it transformed not only how my parents saw my success, but also how our family saw one another. Several months passed, and life gradually settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt different from anything our family had experienced before. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no emotional speeches, no grand celebrations, and no sudden transformations that belonged only in movies. Instead, the changes appeared in ordinary moments, the kind people often overlook because they seem too simple to matter. Sunday dinners became conversations instead of assumptions. My father no longer asked whether business was still going well because he had finally learned enough to ask better questions. Sometimes he wanted to know how a new project was progressing. Other times he asked whether our newest employees were adjusting well or whether customers were satisfied with the latest equipment we had delivered. Those questions told me he had stopped measuring success by headlines and started measuring it by responsibility. My mother changed in quieter ways. Every few weeks, she would send me an article about leadership, manufacturing, or small business growth that she had found while reading online. Occasionally, she highlighted a sentence she thought sounded familiar because it reminded her of something I had once said around the dinner table years earlier. One afternoon, she called simply to ask whether I had remembered to take a day off recently. I laughed because she had spent years encouraging me to work harder whenever opportunities appeared. Now she understood that protecting what I had built also meant protecting the person responsible for leading it. Her concern no longer came from misunderstanding my journey. It came from finally appreciating how much that journey had required. Around the same time, our company completed one of the largest projects in its history. The customer invited our leadership team to attend a small appreciation event celebrating the successful installation of an automated production system that would help expand their operations throughout the Midwest. As usual, I accepted the invitation on behalf of everyone who had contributed because I believed accomplishments always belonged to teams rather than individuals. While reviewing the guest list, I noticed we had received additional invitations for family members. Without thinking very much about it, I called my parents and asked whether they would like to attend. They immediately accepted. On the evening of the event, I watched my parents walk through the customer's facility wearing proud smiles that looked entirely different from the expressions they had worn during their first visit to my company months earlier. This time they were not trying to understand what I did. They were simply enjoying the opportunity to witness another chapter of the journey. During the reception, several business owners introduced themselves after recognizing my parents from previous company events. One customer thanked my father for raising someone who always honored every commitment. Another executive complimented my mother after describing how our team had solved a difficult problem without ever making excuses or shifting responsibility. Each conversation focused less on financial success and more on trust, consistency, and character. I noticed my parents listening carefully, occasionally smiling at one another as though they were slowly connecting pieces of a puzzle that had taken years to complete. Near the end of the evening, while guests gathered for dessert and coffee, The company's president walked onto the stage to thank everyone involved in the project. After recognizing engineers, technicians, project managers, and customers, he unexpectedly invited me to say a few words. I thanked our employees first because they deserved the recognition far more than I did. Then I spoke briefly about partnership, reliability, and the importance of treating every customer relationship as something earned rather than expected. The applause that followed was warm, but what happened afterward stayed with me far longer. As people returned to their conversations, my father quietly approached me holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me, looked around the room filled with employees, customers, and business leaders, and smiled. "I used to think successful people earned respect because of what they achieved," he said. "Now I realize they earn respect because of how they treat people while achieving it." I nodded slowly. That lesson took me a long time to learn too. He laughed softly. Maybe it took me even longer. A few moments later, my mother joined us. She looked towards several young employees laughing together near one of the display tables. "Those people trust you," she said. "Not because you own the company, but because they believe you genuinely care about them." I answered honestly. That trust is the most valuable thing we have. Everything else can eventually be replaced. As the evening came to an end, many guests stopped to say goodbye before leaving. One young engineer, who had joined our company less than a year earlier, shook my hand and thanked me for believing in him despite his limited experience. After he walked away, my father watched him for several seconds before turning toward me once more. "I finally understand something," he said quietly. "You never built this business to prove anyone wrong. You built it to give other people chances that you wish someone had given you." Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of peace because they captured a truth I had never been able to express completely. I had spent years hoping my parents would understand the sacrifices behind my accomplishments, but I now realized the deeper lesson had never been about sacrifice alone. It had always been about purpose. Long hours, difficult decisions, and personal discipline only mattered because they created opportunities that extended beyond my own life. As we walked toward the parking lot beneath the cool Ohio evening sky, my parents no longer saw a son who had simply become successful. They saw someone whose greatest achievement could not be displayed on a balance sheet, engraved on an award, or measured by the size of a company. It was reflected in the confidence of employees, the loyalty of customers, the respect of business partners, and the quiet understanding that genuine success leaves people better than it found them. Watching my parents smile with that new understanding beside me, I realized that some victories arrive not when the world finally recognizes your accomplishments, but when the people who know you best finally understand the reasons you never stopped believing in yourself. 1 year later, I stood in the same production facility where my parents had first begun questioning everything they believed about my journey. The company had continued growing, but not because we chased growth for its own sake. We simply kept doing the same things that had carried us through the difficult years. We honored our commitments. We treated people with respect. We continued improving every process we could improve while remembering that every business decision ultimately affected someone's family, career, or future. Looking across the production floor, I recognized nearly every employee by name, just as I always had. Some had purchased their first homes during the past year. Others had welcomed new children into their families. A few had returned to school using tuition assistance the company provided because they wanted to continue developing their skills. Watching those lives move forward brought me far more satisfaction than any financial report ever could. Success had become something much larger than personal achievement. It had become a shared opportunity that continued expanding through the lives of other people. That afternoon, we held our annual employee appreciation gathering, a tradition that had grown from a simple cookout into an event where employees and their families spent time together outside the pressures of deadlines and production schedules. Children played games on the lawn while parents talked with coworkers they normally only saw inside the office. Laughter filled the air, and for a few hours nobody thought about contracts, schedules, or quarterly reports. They simply enjoyed being part of a community that valued one another beyond job titles. My parents arrived early to help greet guests. Watching them welcome employees felt almost surreal because only a year earlier they had known very little about the world that had become such an important part of my life. My father shook hands with technicians, engineers, and office staff as though he had known them for years. My mother remembered the names of several spouses and asked about children she had met during previous events. They no longer felt like visitors observing my company from the outside. They had quietly become part of its extended family. During lunch, Lauren Mitchell walked over carrying a framed photograph taken during the company's earliest days. It showed the original warehouse with its faded concrete floor, a single workbench, borrowed equipment, and one nervous entrepreneur standing beside his first completed project. I laughed when I saw it because I had forgotten the picture even existed. Lauren smiled. "The team wanted to surprise you," she said. "We thought everyone should remember where this all started." She placed the photograph beside a recent picture of our current headquarters. The difference between the two images was remarkable, yet what touched me most was not how much the company had changed. It was how faithfully we had protected the values that began inside that tiny warehouse. Later in the afternoon, several employees asked me to say a few words before everyone headed home. I stepped onto the small stage without notes because the message had been forming in my mind for years. I thanked every employee and every family member who had supported them through demanding projects and long days. Then I shared something I had rarely spoken about publicly. I told them that people often admired finished accomplishments without realizing that the most valuable part of any achievement could never be photographed or displayed. It lived inside the discipline repeated on ordinary mornings, the promises kept when nobody was watching, and the quiet decisions to continue moving forward after disappointing days. I looked toward my parents as I spoke those words. My father smiled with an expression that carried both pride and humility. He no longer needed me to explain what those sentences meant because he had already lived through the process of discovering them for himself. After the applause ended, guests slowly began gathering their belongings. As the parking lot gradually emptied, my parents remained behind to help clean up a few tables, even though several employees insisted they did not need to. That simple gesture reminded me that some of the strongest expressions of love never arrived through dramatic speeches. They appeared through ordinary acts of kindness offered without expecting recognition. Before leaving, my father asked whether we could walk through the production floor one more time. The building had become quiet after everyone left, and the evening sunlight streamed through the tall windows exactly as it had during their first visit. We stopped near the center of the floor where machines now stood ready for another busy week. My father looked around slowly before speaking. "Do you remember the first thing I said after seeing your award?" he asked. I smiled. "You said I had always been lucky." He nodded with a small laugh. "I believe that because I only looked at what was easy to see. Now, when I walk through this building, I do not see luck. I see years of patience, responsibility, and choices repeated over and over again until they became something extraordinary." My mother gently slipped her arm through his and looked at me with the same warm smile she had worn throughout my childhood. "The greatest surprise was never discovering what you built," she said softly. "It was discovering who you became while building it." For a long moment, none of us said anything else. We simply stood together in the quiet building that had once existed only as a dream inside a worn notebook. Looking around, I realized that every difficult season had given me something far more valuable than business success. It had taught me that recognition arrives when the world notices your accomplishments, but fulfillment arrives when your character remains stronger than your circumstances. As we walked toward the exit, I turned off the lights one section at a time, just as I had done countless evenings years earlier when I was the last person leaving a cold warehouse after another uncertain day. The difference was that I no longer walked into the night carrying the weight of proving anything to anyone. My parents finally understood that what people called good fortune had actually been built one faithful day at a time, and I understood something equally important. The people who love us may not always recognize the journey while we are living it, but when we choose patience over resentment and purpose over pride, understanding has a way of arriving exactly when it matters most.